Hello again, everyone. We'll continue our coverage of the Gligoric variation here. And instead of the bishop going back all the way to c1, in this one we'll look at the bishop going to h4 instead, after we hit it with f6. Now these positions are quite unusual and very typical of the Gligoric variation, but not much else. White wastes some time with the bishop, and it generally gets stuck on g3 on quite a bad square. But in return, he's slowing up us playing f5. If we have to play g5 first, then f5 doesn't work quite as well, because after ef, we have to recapture with a piece. We can no longer play the dynamic g takes f5 and attack. But it does come at a big time cost with the bishop running around to g3, and also, yeah, this bishop runs into trouble later. But the positions are quite different to the other variations in the King's Indian. So we play the usual moves. Now remember, don't play knight c6 here because of d5 and knight d2. Instead, we'll hit this bishop immediately. And in the previous video, we checked bishop c1 and bishop d2 very briefly. But the main move is to go to h4. Now, though we have various moves here, g5 is one main line, but let's be consistent with the knight c6. I think this is the easiest choice for us. Now, white normally decides to play d5 at this point. There's pressure on this pawn on d4. He could castle, but white in general wants to delay castling on the king side in the Gligoric variation for a couple of reasons. That sometimes he's got the idea of creating this bind with h3, g4, or knight d2, g4. For example, if we mix up our move order and play knight c6 immediately instead of knight g4, then there he has this d5 and knight d2 and g4, when it's very difficult for us to generate any counterplay. And also, there are some lines where white actually wants to attack down the h-file. We're not allowing them, but they exist. And that's why white would prefer to keep as flexible with his king and maybe go queenside. So castling at this point, while playable, I don't think should challenge us at all. We play g5, hitting this bishop. And now we can drop back. This is a usual motif in the Gligoric. A knight's job on g4 is done. And so we're hoping to recapture on e5 with a knight if white takes early enough. But if not, we'll come back to h6. Now we've actually transposed to a different line to the one I'm recommending in general. But here it's a good version for us because white has already castled kingside. The main lines, white keeps the king in the center. And for example, as we'll see, after d takes e5, f takes e5, which is how I recommend we recapture. If white has delayed castling the king side, that position could be quite risky because white can go for h4 and attack. But with the king already on the king side, there's no problems there. So we have a typical fight here with the bishop on g3 misplaced, but we've played g5 earlier than we'd like. We'd prefer that pawn back on g6 if possible. But we can't have everything. White has the choice to make. We're threatening to take on d4 twice and play f5, f4. So white needs to do something with the d pawn. They normally capture on e5. Pushing immediately is also possible. I think these positions are easier for us to play. White has this problem with the bishop, and it takes quite a while for white to activate and put some pressure on us on the queen side. Our plan is to jump this knight around into f4. We've seen this idea before. If white captures on f4, we'll probably recapture e takes, followed by f5 and our bishop on g7, which is blocked in by all our pawns at the moment. Suddenly becomes a very powerful piece. We'll combine that with playing for the f5 break to activate the other knight that can hop into d4. We see a couple possibilities. So for example, b4. Now ready to play f5 with the pawn defended. White has to take it. f4 is trapping the bishop otherwise. So we take, and we're threatening g4, hitting that knight away, and h5, h4, trapping the bishop. So white is forced to move the knight away from f3. With that in mind, you might as well move the knight immediately with knight d2, opening the option of playing f3 for that bishop to skedaddle out of there, where it's stuck on g3. So we continue with our plan, knight f4 and f5. White can play on the queen side, we just carry on. Now we're threatening to take on e2 and f4, dropping that bishop, so white's obliged to take on f5. f3 wouldn't help much either. We'll still take and play f4 and g4. And we've got a fantastic version of the normal Mar del Plata pawn storm. So white takes, and now we have the trade-off. White has a nice outpost on e4, make it red, but we've got outposts on f4. While f4 is not traditionally an outpost, because in theory it can be hit away with g3, in practice in this position it is, because the bishop on g3 gets in the way. It's very difficult for white to move that bishop again. And the other knight's landing in on d4. And I think our control is quite good here. I have two good knights versus white's good one knight. We're ready to play bishop f5, queen e8 to g6, or bishop f5 to g6 and h5, and attack on the king's side. White's tried bishop g4, which is the thematic King's Indian idea to trade off light square bishops. And white's actually scored 2 out of 2 here, but only because black hasn't noticed a tactic available. This pawn on d5 is actually very vulnerable, and so we can just take and say thanks to the pawn, and there's not really any compensation here. So that's d5, which gives us quite natural play. de is a more Gligoric-y move. Now, normally it's far more advisable to recapture d takes e5, but now we can play f takes, and this is because white has castle kingside already. If the king hadn't gone kingside, fe is quite loose, that some h4 ideas are going to be quite dangerous, opening up the attack. But as white's king is on the king's side, he's not going to be the one attacking over there. Now, the battle revolves around our control of d4 versus white having d5. The breaks we should watch out for are c4, c5 to some extent, although normally it's not the end of the world, and white trying to get in f4. Now, this is the one we should just check, make sure that it doesn't work, because then we might lose some control of our outposts. f4 at the moment looks unlikely, but we're going to play g4 ourselves to kick that knight away from f3, so we can jump in to the outpost with knight d4. Now, white's main move, in fact, is to prevent us playing g4, or at least ensure that after g4, white can exchange a couple of pawns with h3. The problem for white is, for example, after the logical c5, g4, we can continue our plan, that the bishop on g3 now struggles to get active. White is going to need to play f3 to be able to get that bishop out. But after gf, that's a big weakness in white's position. And so he's sort of playing without a bishop, unless he can get some tactic to work on the h2, b8 diagonal. Here we can take the pawn and defend it. I think that white needs to exchange queens here with queen d5 check to avoid being worse, and then at least he's got some pressure on the pawn on c7. If he doesn't play queen d5 check, we're just ready to hop in with knight d4. Our pieces control the board, and we've got an extra pawn. So check, attack the pawn, which we can defend. And white might try some bishop c4 using the pin. So our next move is likely to be king h8, just shoring up our king and pushing the a pawn. Hit that knight away from b3 so that our knight can once again take up its outpost on d4 unmolested. So c5 isn't anything to worry about. Probably the best try is this knight jump into d5, where there are some tactics to be aware of. First of all, g4 is the automatic move, but here bishop h4 is a bit annoying. White's managed to activate his bishop, and we have to go to d7 with our queen. It's not the end of the world, but I'd prefer not to allow this bishop out if possible. The other kind of thematic idea is knight d4. We'll see this idea if white has put a pawn on b4 already. But there it works well because the white knight on d5 is actually trapped. We'll be threatening c6. And surprisingly, that knight will have no retreat squares after an exchange of knights on d4. But here white is too fast. He's getting an f4. Both of these ideas will be improved if our king is in the corner. So it's a good starting move, and also just gives It forces white to decide on his plan. His plan is generally to get in c5. So he's got two ways to prepare that. Rook c1 is probably the better way. If he pushes with b4, now knight d4 works, because this knight has suddenly lost its retreat square. We're threatening, if the knights are exchanged, then c6, and the knight is actually trapped. For example, knight d4, d4, and the natural c5, c6. White can collect a pawn, but after rook f7, the knight is still trapped. So white will have to give up either two pieces for rook. Here, the two man pieces are much better than rook and pawn, or some shaky piece sacrifice. And again, white doesn't have sufficient play. So after ed4, white could try f4 instead to give the knight the f4 square to escape. After gf, knight takes, queen g5. We're next going to develop our piece with bishop d7. This pawn on e4 is quite weak. We're ready to hop in with knight g4 to e3 or e5. We've got very active pieces. So exchanging knights is tempting, but in fact our pawn on d4 is very useful, controlling the e3 and c3 squares. So it's critical to push immediately, and we'll take. But now we can exploit the fact that the knight isn't actually that well defended and bring in our offside knight with knight hf5. If it's taken, we can take on d5. And pawns start getting exchanged here. Our pawn on c7 is dropping, but so are the pawns on c5 and f5. And we don't have any problems. It's useful to note quite how safe our king is. Now it's on h8. It was a useful prophylactic move. Play king h8 before starting any of these operations. Our pieces are soon going to be very active. So that's b4. Instead, rook c1 to prepare c5 as well. Now knight d4 doesn't work as well because after the exchange in c5, unfortunately we're not trapping that knight, c6, and the knight can jump back to b4. So instead we'll go back to the g4 plan. Now bishop h4, activating the bishop, is the only challenging response. The autopilot retrieve the knight, then we can jump in. Next we'll play c6 to expel the d5 knight. And white has the long-term problem with this bishop on g3, that it can't move at the moment, and f3 always creates a weakness. So bishop h4 is better. Now there's some chaos with bishop f6, which is playable, but unnecessary to go into these complications just for the sake of it. Let's just move our queen. Now we hop the knight in. We're ready to push back white's impressive looking knight on d5 with c6. f3 is the only try to get this bishop on h4 back into the game, but we can push the knight back, exchange, and improve our queen, exploiting the pawn on e4 being loose. If the knights were exchanged, then e4 would drop afterwards. I can defend, but we simply continue developing with bishop d7, and we're ready to play a rook over to e8, queen to g6, and if needed, we can play c5 as well to make sure that our knight remains strong on d4, or that the pawn is well defended on d4. Whenever white exchanges, he'll have a very weak pawn on e4, and we're ready to activate the knight on h6 at the end with knight into g4 with very nice coordination and good chances. That's probably the critical move, though, jumping the knight into d5. h3 is white's most common to at least not be stuck with that pawn on g4, but we can just play g4 anyway. So white's hope is that he'll be able to long-term play f3 and bishop f2 now and maintain his structure. But the downside is his king is rather more vulnerable, and it's taken some time. Now knight e1 is interesting, not allowing us the plan that Nakamura used in the game. We're following Gligoric Nakamura, which was to take on f3 just to get this outpost on d4 for the knight. So white can try knight e1 to prevent it, but after the exchange, which Gligoric played himself the following year, clearly he agreed with Nakamura that this was a good line for black. Again, we'll just play our king into the corner to shore things up, not allow any queen d5 check. Ideas coupled with c5 or c5 and queen b3 check to take. We've got enough time to take a timeout to improve our king here. Next, we'll bring our queen on d8 over to the king side, either e8 to g6 or just immediately to g5. Got ideas of knight g4. But white will have to be careful he doesn't get into some trouble on the h file. Might suddenly go rook f6 to h6 and queen h1 mate. And good game. Another plan once we move the queen is to activate our knight on c6, presuming that white keeps his on e2. So knight d4 isn't really playable. So drop the knight back to d8 to e6. When it eyes the c5 square, perhaps slowing up white's counterplay. Also the d4 square still and f4 for attacking chances. So we've got a lot of dynamism here. Rook c1 is more natural. Nakamura exchanged and jump the knight in. Now you don't want to allow knight takes f3, weakening white's structure and his king. So the bishop moved, and Nakamura simply moved the king across. He quickly took over the initiative and had very good winning chances, although the game ended in a draw. But we're ready simply to play over on the king side again. Queen into g5, maybe knight back to g8 to f6. The knight on d4 is such a good piece. And the bishop on g3 is still not really doing anything. So that is castle kingside. It's a possible move, but we shouldn't be worried once white commits his king. White can also take immediately, d5. Now taking back with the pawn is fine, but this is the structure I was trying to avoid in this video. Unless white creates some big concession. It's just a different type of position, and one that Gligoric players are quite likely to have a lot of experience in, and so there's no reason to allow it. Instead, we'll take with the knight. Now, if white exchanges knights, it's quite different. Then knight g4 is misplaced. It takes a long time to get it back into the game if you have to go knight h6 to f7. And so exchanging it for free for the knight on f3 is a big advantage. And knight's already ready to hop into d4. And the only thing we need to be aware of is always recapture with the knight here. The rook is needed to keep an eye on the f6 pawn. Taking with the rook would allow knight d5 with an embarrassing fork, with the pawn on c7 and the pawn on f6. But here, knight e6 and c6, it's a very pleasant exchange variation style structure. We've got the d4 square forever. Instead, white can castle. We simply develop, hit the pawn on c4. White jump to knight in, and we're getting ready to play f5 now to activate all our pieces. Now that we're out of the pin. For example, knight e1 threatens f4, but we're in time with g5 and f5. All our pieces are nice and active. Queen d2, so it's a general useful move, but white doesn't have a threat yet, so we'll complete our development. And now we're ready to play f5, either immediately or after exchanging knights on f3. Generally, if we get in f5 without playing g5, it means that white's strategy in the Gligoric has failed. White wasted time with this bishop, but on h4, so that we can't go f5. Now, if white really wants the structure with d, d, you can start with h3 at this point, knight h6. Now d5 here will simply transpose to the main line with 11h3 that started with d5, knight 7, and then h3. And if white captures, take, and we have this structure, but h3 is more or less a waste of the tempo. The knight on g4 is misplaced in the structure once the pawns are stuck on d5, on e5 and f6. So the knight needs to come back to h6 to f7 anyway to activate. And so white forcing knight h6 has just given us an extra tempo. Once again, just need to remember, don't take with the rook here. Knight d5 is horrible. So take with the knight to keep the f6 pawn defended. And next we've got knight e6 to c6. And probably knight back to f7 and just reroute our pieces. Once again, white runs big strategic risks because we have the d4 square and white doesn't have the corresponding d5 outpost. So the main move is d5. Now compared to the position with the bishop on c1, knight g4 as pawn sacrifice isn't very impressive here. The bishop's more active on h4, or at least not more active, that's the wrong word, but it fulfills a role in this position, preventing f5. And so we're a bit slower with our counterplay. So knight d4 doesn't quite work for tactical reasons. White can also take on g4 immediately because of that pin. So instead we come back to e7. And now by far the main move is to drop back with the knight. White could also castle here, but it'll simply transpose to 10 castle that we already examined after g5 and knight h6. Now h3 and here playing g4 would be the only serious alternative to the main line, attempting to set up a bind on the f5 square, and it changes the dynamics of the game quite a lot. It's extremely double-edged. White's most common here is castle anyway, but this doesn't make any sense. We can just play g5, g4, and we're already ready to start attacking with some king h8 and f5, and our attack comes very quickly. White's bishop on g3 here simply doesn't make sense. He's not created any major concession from us, and the bishop's misplaced. Castle kingside is just castling into the storm. White can also play queen c2 to try and keep an eye on the e4 pawn, and with the idea of castling queenside. But if White wants to castle queenside, it's far better to start with g4, because that at least binds our pieces on the king side a little more. Here we've got time to first activate this knight, and now after castle we can play f5. Of course, this wouldn't be possible if the g2 pawn were magically on g4, but now we'll get this bishop on g7 involved in the game, and the knight on h6. Ample exchange. And here I quite like the weird sidestep of rook b8. Our threat is simply to play c5, a6, and b5, opening up all the lines towards White's king. We're surprisingly fast with our attack. It turns out that the queen side isn't any safer for the king than the king side. In fact, it's probably a lot weaker. With this bishop on g7's diagonal now open, b2 is going to be very, very vulnerable. Knight d2 is a similar idea to queen c2. White saying a little bit more flexible, gives him one additional idea after g5, knight g6. Now queen c2 would be very similar, but White could play bishop g4 now, as he's defending it with his queen. But we can hop in again, attack the pawn on g2. Now White doesn't want to castle kingside into our attack. f5 is coming fast, but taking the knight isn't helpful either. Once again, remember this recapture to activate our bishop. I'm now ready to play f5 with a very strong bishop and a very nice outpost on e5 for our knight. So the only challenging move, I think, is play g4 here. Now f5 is a bit risky when White hasn't castled kingside himself. Here you're going to take the g file fast. So I think we should change tack. Drop our knight back. White generally plays knight d2, just taking control of the e4 square and improving his position. It doesn't matter so much White's move order, though. We'll play bishop d7 to complete our development. And here, White's king is probably going to go queenside. Going kingside after you've gone g4 is extremely risky. Then we'll go back to our f5 plan, happily. But if White is going queenside, then we want to open up the queenside. So our plan is to play a6, rook b8, and b5, which is going to open up the b file, even if it's a pawn sacrifice. Our queen will join the game, going to a5, after we play either c6 or c5, depending on White's setup exactly. This position is extremely double-edged, and I think it's very, very difficult for White to maintain any kind of control. These positions will be seen far more in the h3 King's Indian, and somewhat in the Petrosian as well, later in the video. And there you'll get more ideas of these kind of positions, where White remains flexible with his king and plays h3, g4. He's going for this maximum control with a bind of f5 to try and squeeze us, but one wrong turn and White is immediately lost. He needs to make sure he's keeping all our pieces out of the game forever, which is incredibly hard to do, as I can attest to from playing this type of position on both sides of the board. I should note that even though engines slightly prefer white here, correspondence players haven't been interested in attempting it at all, which shows that they probably consider it far too risky. But this h3 g4 is certainly a plan that we should remember. But the main move is knight d2, immediately asking us a question with our knight on g4. And here, knight h6 would be a normal kind of move, and h5 is another idea to defend the knight. But I'm going to go for the most direct approach here with f5. After white's play has been designed to prevent this break, so it's kind of nice to play it anyway. Now, the only critical response is to take our knight on g4 and claim our structure is a bit weird. But we have enough counterplay, as I'll show. White castling would just be very risky. Bishop f6 is quite nice. If white were to exchange bishops, we'd have a fantastic version of the classical Mar del Plata variation. We've succeeded in the bishop exchange, which is what we always want, and we're already kickstarted over on the king side. But bishop g3 isn't really helping white either. After b6, is it just generally useful move to stop c5, make it a bit slower for white. But the plan of simply pushing with h5, h4, and trapping that bishop isn't very easy to deal with. White's going to have to create some concessions over there. I could try and create the bind again with h3, g4, saying that we've already committed to f5 here. But I think it's very risky. We can play c6, just making sure that white is never going to be happy going queenside with this king either, with that open c file. All right, f3, bishop d7. White is going to have to be extremely accurate here to maintain his position without it crumbling. Once again, if white goes queenside, we'll combine a plan of rook c8 and cd with b5 and just playing a more direct b5 approach. I don't think people would switch back to h3 and g4 here. It feels far too risky. So I think taking on g4 is critical. White could play it by exchanging first. So we have a much better structure than we will have in the main line. We've managed to exchange the e4 for this g6 pawn, which was a bad pawn that wasn't doing very much. White's hoping that his control of the e4 square gives him some kind of bind. But as we have both bishops, this uncontested light square bishop, I don't think we're going to have any problems. For example, knight e4, queen e8. Now we're threatening to activate our knight. Either g6, f4, the probable route, although f5 to d4 would also be good. Now this bishop on h4 is once again, we're threatening to make it an obscure bishop that is just going to be offside for the entire game. So he should really take when he's got the opportunity. And we have a strange position where we've got bishops versus knights. White's got a nice looking bind on the e4 square, but we'll be able to put some pressure on it with bishop f5 and queen f7 to g6, and then probably push the h-pawn, starting up some attack over there. And with just the two knights, it's difficult for white to actually do anything. If that knight moves from e4, we'll go e4 ourselves and activate the g7 bishop. And otherwise, I don't see quite what white's plan is. He has to decide which way he's going with the king, first of all. If he goes kingside, then our plan of h5, h4 is quite dangerous. While if he goes queenside, we'll be ready to break on the queenside. Once again, playing for the b5 or c6 breaks. So that is taking on f5 first. Finally, we should look at c5. White takes the opportunity to play the break while he can, but after knight f6, we're going to be very quick in our counterplay here. For example, exchange, castle, and now bishop h6 is a nice move. Activating the bishop. Now we might be threatening to take on d2 and take on e4, and win a pawn like that. But a rather bigger threat is exploiting this bishop on h4 and threaten g5 and f4, simply trapping that bishop. So white probably has to give up the bishop. But we've got an uncontested dark square bishop here, and we're going for it on the king side already. I don't think that c5 was a big enough achievement in response. As always, it's so difficult for white to actually find any counterplay on the queen side once he's exchanged his start square bishop. That bishop is needed to put pressure on a7 and potentially the b6 square once we play a6. So critical must be to take. Now white needs to be very accurate. The automatic castle runs into some trouble. We activate our bishop with bishop h6. Now our plan is quite straightforward. We want to play g5, hitting this bishop, force it back to g3, followed by knight g6. Then we can retreat our bishop and play h5, h4, trapping that bishop. For example, b4, g5, knight g6. White succeeding in getting somewhere on the queen side, but now h5, h4. We've seen this before, that the pawn on g4 looks strange, but means that the bishop on g3 is dominated. White is going to have to play f3 to exchange those pawns to activate his bishop, but then he weakens his own king and his own structure. So white should play bishop g5 and extricate this bishop. White's got the chance. Bishop comes back to e3. Not the most natural move, perhaps, but definitely necessary. So this bishop has gone to g5, to h4, back to g5 again, and then to e3. But in return, we've had to damage our structure with f5, f takes g4. Our counterplay here will lie with control of the f4 point, and we'll also set up a fortress on the queen side so that white can't break through. A few years ago, I saw some fun with rook f4 and got excited that if it's taken, we get the dark squares, we've got a big pawn mass on the king side, and the e5 square is going to be a good outpost for our knight. The bishop is very active on g7, but unfortunately white doesn't actually need to take the rook, which is a bit of a cold shower on the idea. So let's just attack the bishop instead. Of course, it goes back to e3. Now white wants to play c5. We've seen this before, that with the knight on d2, c5 and knight c4 is the idea. If white succeeds in playing both those moves, then there'll be some pressure on our pawn on d6, especially cd6 and knight b5. We'll be attacking the pawn on d6 and attacking the pawn on a7. If we have to play a6, the knight will be perfectly placed on c4 to jump into b6. So we don't want to allow that combination here. So we'll play c5 and set up the fortress style blockade that we saw a lot of in the first couple of videos of this course in the Knight BD7 classical. Now, once again, en passant should be taken seriously, and this was Fabiano Caruana's approach in the elite game in this line against Timur Radjabov. Recapture with BC. Now, if white doesn't rush with b4 here, we'll probably play a5 to prevent b4. Once again, it's got similar ideas to ones we discussed there, that it's a fight for the d5 break. So white plays b4, hoping for b5 to push up on away from c6 to get control of the d5 square. So we should act quite quickly, I think, and after b4, simply play d5. It's possible, too, to start with bishop e6. It's a quieter approach, but d5 is more principled, and we can follow Radjabov. Exchange, and here Fabiano played the most dynamic move, bishop c5, exploiting the pin to put some pressure on d5. White could also exchange on d5. When we have quite an interesting position at castle bishop f5, our structure is a bit ugly, and white long-term has this 2 versus 1 majority on the queen side, but our bishops are very active, and the knight on d2 is not so active. If it could somehow live on e4, then white would be doing well, but that's not practical in this line because our pawn on g4 is doing a good job of preventing f3 to support the e4 square. So e4 will always be ours. And we have very active pieces. Our bishop pair are good. We've got the more active major pieces too. For example, white could exchange queens, but then our rooks will be very active on d5 and d8. So I think we can be happy here with that activity. Certainly, Caruana thought bishop c5 was more challenging, and I agree with him. Now things get very forcing, so you should take special care of this position. e4, activating our bishop. Here, Fabiano decided to sacrifice the exchange with bishop takes e7. It's possible to defend the knight with rook c1, but now a nice discombobulating move is e3, exploiting the fact that white hasn't got around to castling yet. Now he can't take with the bishop because d4 forks bishop and knight, so he has to take with the pawn, but now he can't castle, thanks to the open f file. We can continue opening additional lines with a5. If a3, we can swap, and here we've got choice. Rook f7 is a calm move, just asking white what he's intending on doing. His king is going to be stuck in the center for the foreseeable future. He might be able to win another pawn with bishop takes e7 and knight takes d5, but we'll recapture with the queen. We've got a very strong bishop pair, and white has this chronic problem of his king. Can also go for it immediately with d4 here. After ed, knight c6, sacrificing the exchange, but with fantastic compensation. With white's king wide open, an open e file, the dark square is going to be very powerful for us. This bishop on g7 will hop something into d4. It looks like a lot of fun to me. But both options are perfectly fine. So that's a3. White could push, but now we can exploit the fact that the bishop is undefended on c5 with queen c7. Now, if white defends the bishop, then we can just take on c4. So the most challenging is to grab another pawn. And white is 2 pawns up, but our bishop pair are going to be very powerful, and white's still got this big problem of what to do with his king. Our next moves are likely to be bishop f5 and rook a e8, once white deals with how to figure out what to do with his king. The pawn on a2 is also, of course, vulnerable. It might only look like a pawn. But if we get a4, a3 in, then the bishop on g7 does support the queening square. And so this pawn might turn out to be a very strong asset. So rook c1 can be met by the nice e3, keeping white's king trapped in the center. Instead, Caruana swapped, and he takes a pawn with tempo, hitting our queen. But the point is that after queen f7, we're threatening mate on f2 and the rook on a1, so we're collecting the exchange. Queen g5 is also very interesting, with similar ideas. But queen f7, white needs to get his king to safety. We grab. And so white is exchanged for a pawn down. He's got a good-looking knight on d5, so we should immediately challenge that one. And white should now take a second pawn with knight takes e4. If he waits with something like knight e3, rook d8, and we're doing well. Now if white takes on e4, we can take the pawn on c4. Knight takes c4, queen takes c4, knight f6 check. Looks a bit scary, but it's only one check. We can just simply move our king to f7. Even into the corner will be okay, because we'll be able to block the long diagonal in some positions, although here knight d7 check is a little bit awkward. Obviously, check, just make sure that in the precise position you have, knight f6 check isn't a problem. But you can trust me that knight takes e4, bishop c4, knight c4, queen takes. Knight f6 check isn't. King f7 is fine. So, of course, the position is a bit sharp here. Knight takes e4 is the better move, and Fabiano's choice. So white now has 2 pawns for the exchange, but our rooks are doing quite well here because we've got a lot of open lines for them. With E, D, and well, E and C are both open files, and D file to put some pressure on this pawn. Queen d4, and one last accurate move, rook a e8. Now, I think we're doing fine here. The problem is white doesn't really have a good square for his knight. If it goes to c5, for example, then rook e5 is an interesting idea, just going after this pawn on d5. And the most natural move, knight d6, does fork our queen and rook, but queen e5 deals with the threat, thanks to white's queen hanging. Can't take on g4 because the knight is hanging, and after a queen exchange, the d pawn drops. Once the d pawn drops, we're actually doing extremely well. Knights are pretty terrible in these positions with pawns on both sides of the board. They need to be close contact pieces. So if the pawns are all on one side, then the knight is often better than the bishop, but it's woefully outclassed by a bishop or by a rook with pawns on both sides of the board. It's just too slow to jump between the two sides. And the rooks here can just start eating all the pawns. So that is d takes c6, a sharp line that should be checked carefully in Caruana's approach, but theoretically we're doing fine there. Instead, rook b1 is a bit more common. White is going for it on the queen side, but as you'll see, white can't actually break in. g5, it's time for us to jump our knight round to f4. And we have this interesting structure. And I think that objectively the position is just equal, that it's going to be too difficult for either side to make progress. But white does need to be careful because we've got ideas of pushing over on the king side. And need to be careful not to fall into what is a quite logical looking trap we'll set. So white opens up the b file. Of course, we play b6. We need to maintain the pawn on c5. It's doing a fantastic job of blocking in this bishop on e3, which is a pretty bad piece now, actually. Our pawn on c5 is blocking one way, and the pawn on g4 prevents any f3. And now white has a few different move orders, but it's all going to come to more or less the same thing. Our plan is to play the knight into g6 and into f4. Taking the pawn on g2. White never wants to take that because e takes f4, and our bishop re-emerges, blinking into the light on g7. So castle immediately will transpose to the main line after knight g6 and queen a4. Queen a4 immediately looks like the most challenging because the queen is trying to jump in on c6 when we move the knight. But actually the threat is a mirage. Knight f1 is a nuanced way of doing it that's been tried in some correspondence, and I think is white's best way, but still I don't see that white can actually make any progress. Now this is fantastically subtle. I don't think your opponent's going to find this over the board, but white is getting ready to put his knight on e3 and not getting in the way of the rook defending the f2 pawn or the queen, but just any defense across the second rank. So white manages to get his pieces to the proper squares, but the knight attacks the pawn on g4, but he's not going to attack it again, and we can always play h5. So we put our piece on the right squares. And yeah, this was the best version of the setup I could find for white. I still don't think we need to be worried. Our pieces are controlling all of the relevant entry squares, maybe except for b8 if white doubles on the b file. Therefore, I think we should play king h7, just so that if white does get in rook b8, it doesn't pin our bishop on c8. And so we can just exchange rooks happily. The other thing to be aware of is white jumping in with knight f5. I wouldn't worry to take that, because after bishop f5, ef, queen f5, rook f5, knight e4, then the knight has a very good outpost there on e4, dominating our bishop on g7 and attacking the pawn on d6. And it might be a bit of an unpleasant endgame. But we can play around it. We can also put our king in on g6, with the idea that after bishop f5, ef5, queen f5, we take with the king, and then we control the e4 square and don't allow the knight in on e4. Of course, if we get time to play e4 ourselves, we're doing fantastically because we activate the bishop on g7. One other plan here, if we're just stuck for a plan, we'll start with king h7, is that the bishop on g7 is our bad piece here. So I think we should activate it. And it takes a while, but I don't see what white is doing in the meantime. We'll play bishop f8 to e7 to d8 to a5. And the bishop is free. I hasten to add that after I left the engine on for a long time here to try and find a plan for white, its plan was rook b3 to b2 to b1 to b3 to b1 to b2 It just couldn't find any way of doing anything at all here as white. But still, I think that is white's best structure here, and shows that we're doing completely fine. Queen a4 to try and tie a knight down, and we ignore it. Now, if white realizes that queen c6 doesn't actually work, then he might go castle. But still, we'll play knight f4 and h5. We've played our usual setup again. The knight does a good job of putting some pressure on white's king. And we are ready to start attacking over there as well, if white gets completely distracted. Rook b1, h4. Here you can see that white could do with that knight on e3, as we saw in white's best possible setup. Because then we have to be more careful when we go h4, because that g4 pawn might be hanging long term. But here, white can't attack it. We're getting ready for g3 or h3 ideas to open up white's king. For example, h3 and knight into g2 and queen f6. And then if we get rid of the bishop, we're mating down the f file. One serious idea. The queen into c6 still is not a good move. Now, the point, we'll see this for the first time here, and we'll see it in a couple more versions later on, is that we can play bishop d7. It looks like we have to. Our rook is hanging on a8. And white wins a pawn, and are we in a lot of trouble? White's won a pawn, it was a big pawn, c5 is dropping. Yes, but the queen is actually getting trapped. Rook f6. Now white has a choice of pawns to take, e5 or c5, but neither are very appetizing. He takes on e5, rook b6, and we'll take the queen next move. So he has to take on c5, but now bishop f8, and the queen doesn't have a square. d6, bishop takes d6. The knight is covering the d5 square, and so white can resign. Now this key is completely key to the whole variation, that white can't play queen c6 and take this pawn on d6, although it looks very tempting. And I imagine that a lot of opponents will get too far before realizing that that pawn isn't edible. That's why we can kind of just ignore white on the queen side and set up our pieces on the king side with the knight on f4. So queen c6 fails. White could try rook b8. After the exchange, this has been played in a few GM games, g3 or h3, which also seems to be a draw, but g3 is a bit more forcing for us. If white takes fg, we're going to play the same move, h3. Now white can't actually take our knight because the bishop's trapped anyway after gf4, and then we've got an open g file and very dangerous attack. So white does best to take back. Once again, the knight can't be taken because the bishop is trapped, and white's king becomes far too open, and so it's simply a draw. So that was castle doubling rooks and then queen into c6. But we should check the immediate queen jump as well. Now in the only game that actually reached this position, white realized at this point that his whole strategy failed and went queen a6 after bishop c8. That we simply repeat position. Again, it looks like it'll probably be a draw. Instead, taking the pawn obviously needs checking. This time the queen's not actually lost, but white is still going to have to concede too much to escape. So white's 2 pawns up, but that's the end of the good news for white. It's our turn. The queen doesn't have a square, and so he has to play d6, only move. Now compared to before, we already had knight in on f4, so their bishop takes d6 and the queen was trapped, but now he's got the d5 square. So instead we'll take with the rook. The threat is simply to move the rook away, rook takes d2, and the queen is trapped. So white has to stop that. So knight d5, blocking that and giving white the c7 square for the queen. So we take away the c7 square. Now we renew the threat of simply moving the rook, and the queen is trapped on e6 on c5. So white gets the a5 square for his queen. So we take away the a5 square. Now, white sort of has b6, but as you'll see, it's not a great square for the queen. We can go to b6 immediately, but now we can take. The problem is for white that taking with the bishop to maintain the strong knight on d5 fails to simply taking it. The bishop's hanging, and c5, bishop takes e4 would hit the rook, so we'd win a whole piece. Therefore, it should take with the knight, but then we can take on e4 anyway. As we're attacking this rook, and have to take on a8, take on b1. White survived without dropping his queen, but doesn't have any extra material. And our bishop pair are going to be powerful in this endgame. The knight is pretty misplaced on a8, clearly. So this line is quite unusual. We have this odd structure with a double g-pawns. Now, the main line, I think, is what you're most likely to get. And it's worth remembering that the queen into c6 looks like an incredibly scary line. But remember this rook f6, bishop f8, and the queen is actually trapped. I think your opponent's very likely to fall into this trap. And so it's very difficult for white actually to get anywhere. And we can be patient, but this plan of h5, h4, and g3 or h3 can be quite scary. Alternatively, dc, as Caruana played, this en passant, is far more forcing, and these lines should be checked carefully. But from a theoretical point of view, we're doing fine. Thanks a lot for watching. This concludes our coverage of the Gligoric variation. Bye.